My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at this spot that we love just west of Shenandoah. It's quiet, off the beaten path, and offers absolutely spectacular views of both Shenandoah and portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of trip itself were nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep super well because of the humidity. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of Jefferson Forest we'd never been to before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads to an old fire tower we've always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that stuck out to us was how empty the campsites were. We actually didn't camp there the night before because we've heard that the site is usually packed, and we knew that we wouldn't arrive early enough on the weekend to get a spot. There were only 2 spots taken. In one was a desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage. It looked like someone had been there for a while, but it was deserted when we arrived. In the other, there was a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one other smaller car in the parking area. We parked and started getting our gear together, and the woman approached us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read that it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which. Since I was getting such weird vibes from the place, I kind of hoped that she'd stick around and go with us to find it, but she just thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked up and down a few of the ATV trails until we found the walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point, but otherwise didn't encounter anyone else, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour to get to the top of the mountain, where the fire tower was. It was an old metal structure, and you have to climb the narrow set of stairs to get to the top of it. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and started heading down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown. About halfway down, very suddenly, everything stopped. The birds, the bugs. It was dead silent, and I don't know quite how to put this into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and crushing us. I felt trapped and cornered in spite of the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at each other and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling only followed us. As we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between metal on metal and a choir screaming off key. And we saw something. I just got a glimpse of it before we blacked out. I don't know how to describe it, other than it looked huge, despite clearly not taking up much physical space, and moved in flashes. It didn't have a color, it just felt like evil and emptiness. I probably only perceived it for half a second, before my memory just completely gave way. When we came to, we were sitting in the car, and 2 hours had passed. Double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if we lost consciousness or just somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later the exact same thing happened to my partner. Both of the cars were next to us in the parking lot, and there were still just the 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same as she'd left it. I think about her all the time, and I've spent a ton of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and I to talk about that day. Some of the stories I've seen posted on this sub have made me feel so much less alone. We still love to hike, but honestly haven't been up to the Appalachian forests since this happened. I'm curious if others have had other experiences like this. My experience happened back in August of 2014, but it is still vivid in my mind. I was unaware of the missing 411 phenomenon until I stumbled upon this sub recently. I was on a youth group camping trip in New Hampshire. We were coming to a close after 2 days of uneventful camping, and I was tasked with going to tear down the archery range, a temporary makeshift affair we had set up for the youth to practice shooting with bows and arrows. The archery range was down the hill from the campsite, and then down a slight slope to the left, off the trail road to a small oval clearing, abutting the woods and tree line. I walked down to the range by myself and started gathering up the equipment. I had finished making the pile for my first return trip when a very eerie feeling came over me. The sound from the camp up the hill had faded away, and it was perfectly quiet and still, not a whisper of a breeze. There was a humming and a vibration in the air that I sensed in me, if that makes sense. For some inexplicable reason, I snapped my head to the right to view the tree line and noticed that there was an area with thinner brush, like an opening, and I started walking towards it like I was being drawn. As I cleared the tree line and stepped into the woods proper, I could feel the pull to go deeper into the woods become much stronger. Looking ahead, the woods were in deep shadow, with a strange group of 4 trees about 75 feet away, lit by a shaft of light beaming at an angle from above. The light wasn't the normal afternoon yellow sunlight, but a very strange golden color. The light hit the trees in a way that the bases of the trees were glowing in a beckoning way. With the rest of the woods in a shadow and the trees lit up, it created a weird tunnel vision. The compulsion to go investigate the 4 trees was now almost overwhelming. The thought of, "Come see, come quickly, come right now," was insistent. My head was pounding, like a headache without the pain. As I was about to take another step forward, another separate feeling from the depths of my being started screaming at me to stop immediately. I instantly viscerally knew that, despite how enticing this call was, if I proceeded forward towards those trees, I would be lost to the world. That specific impression, lost to the world, scared me deeply. The feeling of "this is not right" and "danger" were palpable to me. This somehow overrode the compulsion. I quickly looked backwards to the opening, and I could see the boughs sitting on the ground, and I think seeing a bit of reality helped me break the hold of the call. I suddenly felt a hollow pit in my stomach, and I started tracing a path slowly backwards towards the opening. I kept my eyes on those trees, like I was facing down a predator. I didn't want to turn my back on them. I couldn't turn my back on them. Making it back and stepping through the opening to the archery range, my head almost instantly cleared. I could again hear noises from the camp and feel the wind. I looked at where I had just stepped from, and it now felt normal. I immediately grabbed the first load of equipment and headed back to camp. For some reason, I didn't tell anyone at camp what I experienced. On my subsequent trip to get the last load of equipment, absolutely everything was normal, but I stayed the hell away from that opening. What stands out to me is the lost to the world impression. It was so clear and ominous and final. I can't express how truly drawn I was to go deeper into those woods. The feeling to give myself over to it, whatever it was. I do know that something not good would have happened if I hadn't heeded that warning. I know that my experience was very real and very scary. I am also convinced that I wouldn't have come out if I had kept going that day. I have told this story to several friends, family, and coworkers, partly to tell a weird experience I had in the forest, and partly to see if I could get some insight onto what I experienced. I am also interested in hearing from people reading this, what they think might have happened. I have photos of the area that I am hoping to attach to this post. I am originally from northwestern Ontario, and I have been in and out of forests my whole life. I grew up hunting, fishing, camping, and have gone on many remote backcountry canoe trips. I have also worked in the forest for a few different jobs. I have always felt very comfortable in the forest and have never had a bad experience. That was until working in the forest near New Liskeard, Ontario. I was working as an ecologist in the district of North Bay, Ontario. As an ecologist, I had many different jobs that brought me to every end of the district. One of those jobs involved conducting inventory on old logging cut blocks. This is something that I have done multiple times over multiple summers in different areas of the province. This particular block was located west of New Liskeard, about 45-minute drive out of town. The area was very rural, with farm fields and the odd farmhouse scattered throughout. While driving the roads, it was common for other vehicles to stop and stare at you. This might be because we were driving in a marked truck, or that we were the only people the locals didn't recognize. The block we looked for hadn't been cut since 1995 and was located down this old, rarely used logging road. The two of us were tasked with collecting data on the block. To get to the block, we had to turn off this overgrown road that barely fit a truck. The road had many mud pits that nearly sunk our truck at multiple locations. When we couldn't drive any further, we had to walk the rest of the way to the block, which took about a half hour. The work started the same as any other day. While we worked, we talked about office drama, funny experiences we'd have, and what good movies we'd watched recently. As we got further into the block, I started to feel my chest get tighter. As we continued, I started feeling like we were being watched through the trees. These feelings got stronger the further we traveled into the logging block. I tried to shrug them off until my coworker suddenly stopped reciting the data we were collecting, looked at me, and said,
"I have a terrible feeling about this place."
We then discovered that we'd both been feeling like we were being watched and that something wasn't right about this area of the forest. We continued our work with the unsettling feeling persisting. As we continued further into the cut block, keeping our conversation, we suddenly stopped dead in our tracks, dropping the last word that was uttered. We both heard what sounded like two people having a conversation. This we couldn't comprehend because we were in a remote area, deep down this almost undrivable trail, on which we saw no sign of people. Then, another hour walk into the bush to get to our location in the cut block. The forest was too thick to be of any use recreationally, and it was not hunting season. What was also troubling was that we couldn't make out what was being said. The voices would continue for a few seconds, then disappear as quickly as they started. Once they stopped, we would continue our work, but be stopped in our tracks as the incomprehensible voices would pick up a few minutes later. This pattern continued until we came across trees that had been bent over and snapped. Now, it's not uncommon to find trees bent and snapped from bears, moose, and even the weather. But what was odd about these trees was their proximity to other trees. We would find a tight cluster of trees with the middle tree snapped and the others untouched. The trees were also free of any rub marks or scarring. Then we came across a patch of younger poplar trees that were completely surrounded by an almost perfect circle of dense spruce and pine trees. Within the patch, almost all of the poplar trees had been snapped and bent down in different directions, but the surrounding evergreens were untouched. Neither of us had ever seen anything like this before, and with the feeling that someone was watching us, we quickly got out of the area. As we moved back out of the block, the voices stopped, and the feelings of dread and being watched drifted away. We both expressed that it felt normal again, and that we were only a half-hour walk away from where we had the experience. I have shown different foresters the photos looking for an explanation, but never received a clear answer. The best I received was, maybe the soil composition is different in that location, but all expressed how they'd never seen trees broken like that. I've asked First Nation individuals from different communities and have been told by multiple people that what I experienced was a bad omen that shouldn't be talked about. Now that I type that out, I'm starting to have second thoughts about whether or not this is a good idea.